Thank you, Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, for agreeing to speak to us today. Welcome to Jerusalem, and thank you for giving your time for the International Conference on Forgiveness, Mechila, that we're holding here in Jerusalem. It is a great honor that you've agreed to be one of our speakers. We're very grateful.
Thank you.
Rabbi Sachs, well, let's get straight to the nub of the issue. What is forgiveness?
I think it's important to look at the history of forgiveness because we tend to think that forgiveness is a human universal. And a philosopher called David Constan wrote a book a few years ago, 2011 I think, called Before Forgiveness. And it's a very interesting study because it tells us forgiveness was a relatively late arrival on the human scene. And according to him, the Greeks did not have a concept of it. They had a similar concept, and I hope my pronunciation is not wildly off, which they called sugnome. Sugnome means appeasement. Now, appeasement is a human universal. In fact, it's more than a human universal. You can find it among the chimpanzees, the bonobos, the primates. There has to be some mode of conflict alleviation. So if somebody has attacked the alpha male, for instance, in a chimpanzee group and failed, there has to be some form of appeasement, which means appearing, with a bowed and shame-faced sort of appearance to say you recognize that you did wrong and you're not going to do it again. That is appeasement. It's not forgiveness. So, for instance, when Jacob is about to meet Esau after 22 years, he sends him this huge set of gifts of cattle, hoping to appease his anger. Forgiveness has not yet entered the scene. So the first recorded instance of forgiveness in world literature, according to Constan, and I think he's right, is Joseph at the end of the book of Genesis. You remember the first thing he does when he discloses his identity to his brothers is say, don't feel bad about this, it wasn't you, it was God, and so on. But he doesn't actually use the word forgiveness. And therefore, that's on the first time he reveals that he's not just the viceroy of Egypt, Sophnas Panach, but actually their long-lost brother Joseph, whom they sold into slavery. But in the last chapter of Genesis, after Jacob has died, the brothers fear that he will take revenge. And they say, and it's a lie, but it's a benign lie, that Jacob was concerned about this and asked Joseph to forgive them. And Joseph does just that. So the book of Genesis, which is a book of sibling rivalry, Cain and Abel, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers, ends with forgiveness.
It's fascinating because you said asks for forgiveness. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering whether you've indicated that in order to have forgiveness, there has to be a request for forgiveness. Do you see that as integral to forgiveness?
It's not necessary, but it helps. But what fascinated me was what has to happen to our understanding of the human condition for forgiveness to make its first appearance. It's like, there's a critical moment when the first multicellular organisms appear, or when the first Homo erectus appears. So you want to know what has to happen for forgiveness to appear. And I think three things have to happen. Number one, you have to have a concept of human free will. Hence moral agency, hence moral responsibility, hence the possibility of change. Though that is quite a difficult belief to sustain. It's the driving belief of the Hebrew Bible, but it hasn't always been the prevailing belief. Secondly, I think you have to recognize that there's a difference between what anthropologists call a shame morality and a guilt morality. A shame morality is one where there's no way back, where when evil has been committed, it is a stain on the character. So in a shame morality, there's no way back. The shamed character either goes into exile. I hate to mention Australia, but in the English plays it used to be Australia. You know, you get sent off there, or goes up into the study and you hear the sound of the gun and he commits suicide. So that from a shame morality, there's really no way back. In a shame morality, you have to pray that no one finds out. But in a guilt morality, there is a principal distinction made between the sin and the sinner. So the act was bad, but the person, the agent, remains the image and likeness of God. So there's something pure there that remains that you connect with in the act of forgiveness. The act is put to an aside, and the agent and your relationship with the agent is reaffirmed. So that's a second big distinction. And there's a third big distinction, which René Girard writes about in his books on religious violence, which is a move from the settling of difference through I-thou relationships, which is the blood feud. You know, somebody kills your brother, you kill their brother. I mean, it's up close and personal. From that, there's no easy way out, because the cycle of retaliation is, in principle, endless. So, and of course, Girard held that you invent a scapegoat to bring an end to that cycle. But the real end, as he points out, is a system of law. Once you have a system of law, it's not the Montagues against the Capulets, or what is it in The Godfather, the Corleones against the Titaglias. It is both under the impartial bar of the law. So you have depersonalized the conflict. Once you can rely on a legal process to punish the guilty, then you can say that my personal ill will is no longer significant here. It's no longer needed to sustain the moral order of the universe. And I can then forgive, because forgiveness is the I-thou element in human relations as opposed to the law-bound element in those relationships. Once you put those three things together, you get forgiveness. Genesis cannot reach closure until somebody has forgiven somebody. And I wondered, why is it that forgiveness plays no part in the major stories of Genesis? Why doesn't God forgive the generation of the flood, or the builders of Babel, or the people of Sodom and Gomorrah? There's no prophet calling them to repentance. But there is in Exodus 32, after the sin of the golden calf, when Moses prays for forgiveness for the people, and God forgives. So why does divine forgiveness only appear in the book of Exodus? And I reached the conclusion that the Bible is telling us here that God cannot forgive us until we learn to forgive one another. And that then becomes a very, very powerful message. So, for instance, on our great annual Day of Forgiveness, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, it's absolutely fundamental that we reach a state of forgiveness with our fellow human beings before we can ask God to forgive us, because how can we ask him to forgive us if we are not prepared to forgive one another?
So forgiving one another, you've put the burden on the person doing the forgiving. The question is, and I raised it earlier with regards to apology or asking for forgiveness. I'm wondering, in Judaism, that reciprocity there, is that significant?
It's not necessary, but it is significant. The single most important thing in Judaism is, has the wrongdoer recognized his or her wrongdoing? Have they experienced charata, remorse? Have they committed themselves to admitting, vidui, confession? Have they pledged themselves seriously to doing differently in future, Kabbalat ha'atid. Once those three elements are in order, then forgiveness is not merely a benign act. I think it's pretty much a normative act. It's something you really ought to do.
Yes, that's very interesting. The forgiveness, there are many words in Hebrew for forgiveness. It's not a single term, so it's very complex.
You have slicha, you have mechila, you have kapara, and you have tahara. And the nuances between those four words are very subtle. And even the use of those words is different depending on whether it's a priest speaking or a prophet speaking. So a prophet uses the verb in the kal, in the simple form, God forgives. Whereas in the entire priestly literature, it's always in the nifal, the nislach, lo. So these are subtly different words, but one has to do with ending the state of ill will. One, kapara, means effacing the trace or the memory of the wrongdoing. And there are various other forms of nuance, but it's a complex process, yeah.
It certainly is. And forgiveness is connected with other values. You've talked about it in other places. It's connected with justice. And I wondered whether that also related to your comment earlier about an overriding legal system.
Yeah.
And that legal system, of course, can be the divine legal system as well as any state system. But I wondered if you'd speak about the connection between forgiveness and justice, or the relationship.
Justice is impartial. Forgiveness is deeply personal. Justice must be impersonal. The person who really understood this was, believe it or not, the quantum physicist Niels Bohr, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist. And Niels Bohr developed something called complementarity theory, because there was a long-standing debate, is light a series of particles or a series of waves? And Niels Bohr tells the following story, that his son was found guilty of stealing something from the local shopkeeper. And Niels Bohr found himself reflecting on how he should respond to his son as a father and as a judge. And he realized that he would respond completely differently in the two cases. As a judge, he couldn't forgive him. He had to impose the law. If a judge forgives somebody because he's a relative, that is a perversion of justice. That's not justice. Whereas as a father, he wanted to forgive him. So he said, both are true. It's just that you can't think both at the same time. So that is the relationship between justice and forgiveness. They're both ways of seeing the world, but not at the same time. That then explains one of the most famous of Jewish prayers, which we say especially in the High Holy Days, the words Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. That's Niels Bohr's complementarity theory. A king executes justice. A father forgives. And it was Rabbi Akiva, the great Rabbi Akiva, the great first and early second century rabbi, who coined that phrase, Avinu Malkeinu. In other words, he is saying to God on the day of judgment, we know you are our king. And we know, therefore, that we deserve punishment because we have sinned before you. But even before you are our king, you are, as Jesus called it, Abba, your daddy. And therefore, please forgive us.
So in that case, you're suggesting that in our deepest relationships, forgiveness will override justice.
They belong to different parts of the human condition. So, and the most important thing in understanding forgiveness is forgiveness belongs to a different domain from justice. And it gets quite complicated when you try and fuse or confuse the two. There is, I suppose, if I am the only victim and somebody steals something, you know, the priest in Les Miserables, you remember? He offers hospitality to this escaping Jean Valjean, I think it is, who steals his candlesticks. And eventually he discovers, and he says, look, here's my cutlery, take my candlesticks as well. You know, you can do that if you're the only victim. You cannot forgive by foregoing justice if the victim is somebody other than yourself. That is a logical requirement, I think, not a theological one.
And that's fascinating. So, in your experiences, Chief Rabbi in particular, have you had to balance those questions either on behalf of the Jewish community or within the Jewish community?
Firstly, obviously, anyone in public life had better be good at forgiving or forget going into public life, because they're going to people who are going to attack you all the time, and some of them will do so with great justice on their side, and that's a learning experience. You don't take that badly, but some of them are going to do so for quite malevolent motives, and you better forgive them, otherwise you're going to be a wounded animal and you have no right to be a leader. So I think that capacity to forgive is an absolute precondition of leadership. You've just got to do it, and it's a hard lesson. I would even say, become a leader in order to learn how to forgive.
Wounded animal.
Yes.
Somebody who doesn't forgive is likened to a wounded animal.
Yep.
Could you say a bit more about that?
Well, you harbor resentments, and if you harbor resentments, you will eventually take revenge, and revenge is forbidden, as you know, in Leviticus, in the same line as you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Leviticus 19, verse 18, you do not do not bear a grudge or take a revenge, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord your God. So taking revenge is strictly forbidden. Interpersonal revenge is strictly forbidden in Jewish law, and therefore you must forgive. You must forgive. And the Jewish legal approach to forgiveness is called tochacha, which means if somebody has offended you, and you're not immediately moved to forgive them, then you have to talk it through. You have to say, I think you said something that was very wrong, and you have to give them the chance to say, I didn't mean it, or you misinterpreted it, or I did mean it, and you didn't misinterpret it, but I'm terribly sorry that I offended you. One way or another, you reach conflict resolution, and you then forgive. That's the previous verse in Leviticus 19:17. So I think you have to do a lot of personal forgiving as a religious leader, and that's, I think, comes with the territory of leadership as a whole. But there was a very interesting moment which I was not expecting, which is that, as you know, the Anglican Communion meets as a communion, as a global communion, once every 10 years. It's something called the Lambeth Conference. And in 2008, I was invited to address a plenary session of the Lambeth Conference. I'm not sure whether that was the first time a rabbi had ever addressed all the Anglican bishops in the world. And they asked me to speak about the concept of covenant, which I did. And then Rowan Williams, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, said, Jonathan, would you take questions? And I said yes, which was a fairly hazardous thing to do, because the third question was, tell me, Chief Rabbi, what is your view of Jesus? And it's a little difficult to do standing on one leg, as the saying goes, in front of the entire global gathering of Anglican bishops. So I said, look, I can't give you a full answer, but I can tell you the point at which I, as a Jew, most resonate with Jesus, and where I think he was being at his most Jewish, which is as he is taken out to the crucifixion. He says, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. I said, you may not know this because it is not noted in any New Testament I have ever seen, that is a paraphrase of a significant verse in Numbers chapter 15, which we say at the holiest night of the year, which is Kol Nidre night, the night of Yom Kippur, immediately after the Kol Nidre prayer. And the line is, V'nislach l'chol ha'am, v'lager hagar b'torcham, ki l'chol ha'am bishgaga. which paraphrased is, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." So when Jesus was saying, "Forgive them," he was speaking as a Jew. And then I turned to the hall and I said, I believe that Jews and Christians have caused one another pain for a very long time. And now the time has come for us to forgive one another. And I think that created a little moment. I know that because everyone blogged about it. So that was a great moment of collective forgiveness, I felt, between the Jewish community and the Anglican Communion, which was a very important one.
Having mentioned the Jewish and Christian relationship in this holy land, we have the third religion of Islam, and I wondered whether you had any reflections on the relationship between Judaism and Islam and the connection with forgiveness.
I don't. I have to be honest here. I haven't studied forgiveness in Islamic theology, but I can tell you of a moment when the issue became very clear to me. I used to make a half-an-hour television program for the BBC every year, which was shown shortly before the Jewish New Year. And in 1999, the BBC asked me to make that television program from Kosovo. The NATO action was just coming to an end. 300,000 Kosovan Albanians who were Muslims had fled the country during the summer, mainly to Macedonia, and they were now coming back. And you remember, who was it, Karadzic or Milosevic, whoever, I've forgotten which one it was, had been stirring up hatred of the Muslim community by reminding everyone of the Battle of Kosovo of 1389. And I stood, and they still hadn't cleared the bomb rubble from the center of Pristina. And I stood in front of the main square in Pristina amidst all this bomb rubble. And I said, here and now you can see the power of a single word to change the world. If the Christian and Muslim communities of Kosovo can forgive one another, they have a future. But if not, they are destined to replay the Battle of Kosovo for all time. And I think that underscores the significance of forgiveness for the future of humanity. I think the person who really understood this and said it quite well was Hannah Arendt in her book, The Human Condition, in which she points out that forgiveness is the only thing that liberates us from the grip and the hold of the past. And it is also the paradigm case of an action that is not a reaction. Revenge is a reaction. Forgiveness is the opposite of a reaction. So it seems to me that forgiveness is probably the single most important human value, whether you're looking at the micro scale of a family, of husband and wife. All families have to forgive each other daily. Otherwise, forget it. And more generally, between faiths, between countries, and between civilizations.
You mentioned elsewhere that forgiving allows us to live with the past, but not in the past. I'm quoting Jonathan Sacks there. And
well, I'm only quoting Moses here in Deuteronomy 23, because, tucked away in a very dense biblical passage is one phrase, a half sentence, of absolutely transformative power. He says, "Lo t'ta'ev Mitzri," do not hate an Egyptian, ki ger hayita ba'artso, for you were a stranger in his land. It's the most counterintuitive sentence imaginable. Don't hate an Egyptian because you were a stranger in his land. they didn't put up the Israelites in the Cairo Hilton. They enslaved them, persecuted them, and practiced slow genocide against them. And Moses is saying, don't hate them, because you were a stranger in his land. And I'm thinking, why on earth is he saying this? And why is he saying this in the last month of his life to the next generation? And I think the answer is, had the Israelites not forgiven the Egyptians, he would have taken the Israelites out of Egypt, but he would not have taken Egypt out of the Israelites. And the result would be that they would still be slaves, not in body, but in mind and in spirit, slaves to the past. And therefore I paraphrase Moses, and I think this is quite a strong paraphrase, by saying, I've taken you from slavery to the brink of the Jordan and to a land of freedom. To be free, you have to let go of hate. And I take that as one of the most important maxims that we have yet to learn in the 21st century.
It took 40 years in the desert.
It took 40 years.
And we're sitting here in Jerusalem, and there are going to be people in this room watching this video who are going to be asking, am I ready to forgive, and how do I forgive now in my current situation? It's almost as though you're asking the Jewish people while they're still in Egypt to forgive the Egyptians. Is it possible?
It's extremely tough. It's extremely tough. So when you're talking about international conflict, especially long-standing conflict, you need a leadership on both sides that is capable of really shifting the paradigm. I knew Judea Pearl. Judea Pearl was the father of Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street journalist who was murdered in Karachi. I did a television program of Judea Pearl, who lost his son to terrorists in Karachi, and Akbar Ahmed, who was the Pakistani High Commissioner in London. And they had become friends, and I took them, they spoke, I filmed them talking to one another, then I took them both into a Muslim school and a Jewish school, where the sight of these two people together just was very, very powerful on young people. And I asked Judea, what is moving you? You've just lost your son. And he said to me, hate killed my son, so I am going to dedicate the rest of my life to fighting hate. And of course, probably without being fully conscious of it, he was echoing the late Martin Luther King, who said something very similar. So in the end, it takes a Judea Pearl, a Martin Luther King, a Nelson Mandela to move from reaction to the act that is not reaction, which is forgiveness. But two people like that have to meet. And, I just felt it an enormous privilege to meet a Muslim and a Jew who were able to take those steps toward one another. And that's what we need right now. We need a Muslim who realizes, I have to apologize for what my people have done, and an Israeli who says, I need to apologize for what my people has done. And it's a very, very risky thing. I knew the late Yitzhak Rabin, and I supported him all the way down the line on the peace process. But I remember in October 1995, when there was building up an intensely hostile reaction within Israel to what Yitzhak Rabin was doing, I publicly supported him by putting an article in the press. At the same time, privately, I wrote him a letter, a long letter, saying, Kvod Rosh HaMemshala, dear Prime Minister, please, I think you need to spend as much time in dialogue with Israelis as with Palestinians, because I feel a great danger building up This was in October. I didn't get a reply. And I knew he had seen and read the letter because the ambassador told me. I think it was November the 4th. I was in Liverpool at the time. We heard the news, Motzei Shabbat, about the assassination. The next day, I flew out with the Prime Minister, John Major and Tony Blair, to the funeral. We came back on the Monday, and I went straight to the embassy because the ambassador had to stay in London dealing with the media and couldn't go to the funeral. And as I came into the embassy, he held me out a letter saying, "This has just arrived for you in the diplomatic bag." It was Yitzhak Rabin's letter to me, perhaps the last letter he wrote, a 3-page letter which we have framed in our office, of a man utterly, utterly dedicated to peace. So it takes a risk to deliver the action that is not a reaction. And people have given their lives for it. The paradox is that in war, even ordinary, quite ordinary people become heroes. But in pursuit of peace, even heroes find it quite difficult. And the true heroes sometimes lose their lives over it. So anyone who thinks it's easy is really not fully understanding the depth of the issue. It's difficult, but there is no other way.
I think you're suggesting that there can't be real peace without forgiveness and a way of relegating the past to the past so that you can move on to the future.
Any peace process that is imposed from the top down is a purely political process, done for reasons of exigency. After all, one of the greatest forces for peace is sheer exhaustion. So, none of those things are going to hold in the long run without a coming together that we call reconciliation and, at a certain level, forgiveness. And that begins with a change of attitudes on both sides. And that can only happen through what we teach our children. And if we allow people to teach their children to hate, then all the peace initiatives in the world are destined to fail. It seems to me that there is a universal and timeless truth in that wonderful line from the Avot to Rabbi Natan, Ezehu Gibor, who is a hero, not one who conquers an enemy, but Ha'osesoneh Ohev, one who turns an enemy into a friend. Now that is heroism, and it is doable. We have seen it happen between the Jewish people and the Catholic Church after the meeting of Pope John the 23rd with the French Jewish historian Jules Isaac in 1961, which led to Nostra Aetate and Vatican II under Paul VI. And today, Catholics, having been estranged for 17 centuries, today meet as friends. It can happen. I gave you a tiny example of a little moment with the Anglican Communion and among my closest friends during the 22 years I was Chief Rabbi were George Carey and Rowan Williams, the two Archbishops of Canterbury, with whom not only did I work closely, but with whom we had a real human friendship that made a huge difference, I think, to our lives. And it can happen wherever people set their minds to it, because if we are free, we cannot change the past, but we can change the future by liberating ourselves from the past.
Such a beautiful closure to our conversation, and I think you've described what you mean by a forgiving community, which is one of the focuses of this conference, the idea of a forgiving community. But I just wondered if, as a final word, you'd share with us your vision for this part of the world or for a world full of forgiveness.
Well, I sat in North Carolina in Duke University with a wonderful young Muslim scholar, Imam Abdullah Antepli. And there was real friendship. I would even say love between us. And I found that very, very moving. I was in Washington a few months earlier than that, in February of this year, for the National Prayer Breakfast. And there I shared a platform with a remarkable Sharia scholar from currently in Abu Dhabi, Sheikh bin Baya, who convened the gathering of imams that delivered one of the most important statements from the world of Islam in recent years, in January 2016, the Marrakesh Declaration. And although he couldn't speak English and I can't speak Arabic, there was we had a long conversation through an interpreter. There was real engagement between us. So there can be that kind of friendship. And it is that kind of friendship that changes the world. If we truly believe in forgiveness, then beneath that, as I have said, lies our God-given freedom. The future does not have to be an endless replay like what used to be a cracked gramophone record. It doesn't have to be like that. And therefore we are at our most divine when we are at our most free. We are at our most free when we are at our most loving. And when we are at our most loving, we cannot but forgive. And that is the challenge God holds before us in every generation, but never so urgently and insistently as now.
Thank you so much, Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Thank you indeed.